right, thanks for joining the Hunting Illinois podcast. Today, we've got a special guest sitting down with us, and actually, our own coworker Lauren has been able to do some pretty cool stuff with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies recently, and that put her in contact with Bryant White. Bryant is somebody that I met several years ago through trapping circles, and he's a name that most trappers know very, very well. And if you are a trapper and you don't know him, you're going to know him after this podcast, because we're going to be talking about one of the coolest wildlife related research projects out there, and it's the trapping BMPs, so the trapping best management practices. And this is actually a slew of different studies that have all come together to basically make our trapping methods, our capture methods for wildlife, the most humane, most selective, the safest, most efficient means possible. And this has been going on for a long, long time. So I'm going to quit blabbing about this because we've got the guy himself, Bryant, here. First off, little introduction to you, Bryant. How long have you been in your current role with AFWA, and what was it that made you want to work with fur bearers and the trapping community?
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. I'm really excited to be here today. But to get right to your questions, I started my current role with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies over 2 decades ago now. I started all the way back in 2002, long enough to see what we call the BMP program through a lot of milestones, but not so long that I'm telling stories about, well, back in my day kind of thing, but well, occasionally I do that. But in this role, my job is to kind of coordinate the national effort to develop best management practices for trapping, or what we call BMPs, through coordinating the field projects where we capture animals, the lab work where the animals get necropsied, and that's what Lauren participated in, just a couple of weeks ago, and I know you've done that as well, Curtis. But and then also to just promote best management practices for trapping through a lot of outreach and education. And so, that means I get to work with a mix of state and tribal and federal agency wildlife biologists, veterinarians, trappers all over North America, really all around the world. And so, every day for me is a combination of science, policy, and occasionally trying to find self-service out in the middle of nowhere when I'm having fun doing a research project. So been with AFWA for a pretty good while. And your second question, what led me to kind of want to do this, to work with trapping, to work with fur bearers. I grew up in Middle Tennessee on a cattle and horse farm. So I grew up in the outdoors, and I've always been fascinated by the intersection of wildlife and people and the tools, mainly trapping and hunting, that we use to manage that relationship. And, fur bearers in particular are really some of the most adaptable and challenging species to work with, because, some of them are prey species, some of them are predators. They're carnivores, they're omnivores, they're herbivores, they're semi-aquatic, they're terrestrial. And so when we say fur bearer, it's just a fascinating and incredibly diverse group of animals. And I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to work with them. But, and then the trapping part of that, trapping is one of the oldest and most effective ways to manage those species. So I like the idea of working on something that really combines hands-on skill, but then also a lot of science-based management, and the connection between tradition and modern conservation. I always found that to be interesting. And, trappers are some of the most passionate, skilled outdoors men and women that you'll ever meet. So it's never boring. There are a lot of great characters out there that I've gotten to meet. And I wanted to tell a personal story real quick, if that's okay, about how I actually got into trapping. I've told this story a few times in a few different places, but when I was probably about somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, my brother and I used to get Fur Fishing Game magazine, and I suspect a lot of people did back in that day and probably still do today. We would go down to the local store, we would buy it off the rack there. And my brother and I had decided that we were going to, when we were old enough, to move to Alaska and be longliners. That's what we were going to do. That was going to be our career. We were going to hunt moose, and we were going to trap wolves and wolverines and beavers and things like that. So we figured we needed to get some experience doing this. So we ordered some traps, and, back during that day, Fur Fishing Game magazine, you could order traps out of the back of that through the different ads. And so we ordered about a dozen number one long spring traps from Victor. Those traps came. There were no trapper education, programs at that time, at least not in the state of Tennessee where we lived. And so we kind of had to figure this out on our own. But we went out, we set those traps. The first thing that we caught was a coon dog from the neighboring farm. And so we let the dog go. It was fine. It was just a hungry old dog, and I think just about any bait would have attracted it. But we went home and told Dad about catching the dog. He tanned our hides very promptly. So the only hide that got tanned was ours. But the next time we caught the dog, we didn't tell Dad. So because that poor old coon dog was always hungry. If you saw him laying down, you'd just think he was dead. He was so skinny. But
oh, man.
Yeah, but that's how I got into trapping, and gotten a little better, a little more selective, understand a few more things about it now. But there's always a need for trapper education out there for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, you're really speaking my language there, talking about the diversity of the fur bear group. I always say that same thing, like when when people are talking about the different just suites of animals in Illinois, and I'm like, man, fur bear is where it's at. You got so much diversity. You've got everything from the largest, we've got the largest rodent in North America, the beaver, all the way down to the smallest vertebrate carnivore in the world, of the least weasel, and everything in between, our one marsupial, the opossum, and there can't be another, like, as far as management goes, no other group of critters that management is lumped together is as diverse as fur bears. I pretty much stand by that one.
Yeah, no, that's true. And if you think about how we lump other things together, small game, large game, still the diversity among fur bears is light years ahead of these other groups.
Well, we even get stuff here like the woodchuck, or East Coast we call it a groundhog, but where I'm from, but that's lumped in. It's not technically a fur bear, but it counts. It gets trapped. It gets counted in Illinois. It's close enough.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I know this occurred. I know you've been with AFWA for a long time, but the BMPs, believe it or not, have even been around longer than you. Well, it was like 1992 when all that process started, and I know that was before you. But can you kind of take us back to that time and let us know, like, what kind of led to the creation of the BMPs? Why did AFWA get involved in trap research in the first place? Where did that impetus come from?
Yeah, that's a lot of people are interested in that history, and we've published that in different places, but I'll give you the 2-minute version of that. It was really back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, starting in Europe. The European Parliament at that time considered banning the import of furs from countries that used foothold traps. And that was going to be a big problem for us here in the U.S. That would have been a major blow to the fur trade, because that's where, at that point in time, most of our fur was going into Europe. But it was also going to be a big problem for wildlife management programs across the U.S., because most of our trappers at that time, and still the majority of trappers today, use foothold traps. And so it was going to, eliminate a lot of the trapping that was going on, that agencies were allowing to take place for wildlife management objectives. And then, fur trappers participating in those programs, it was basically going to be the end of that. And so agencies recognized that that was going to be a problem. And so the association, which is kind of a conglomeration of all the state and many federal agencies, tribal agencies, was asked to step in and see what we could do. So there were years of negotiations that took place. And finally, in 1997, we reached an agreement. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the European Union. And so instead of banning products, the United States agreed to scientifically evaluate traps using an international animal welfare standard that was kind of developed during that same period of time, and then share those results so that the best tools could be used in the field by our trappers here in the United States, and by anyone using traps, really, whether that's someone trapping for fur harvest, for wildlife damage management, a researcher capturing animals to put radio collars on them or whatever. Anyone using traps in the U.S. could use those traps that had been scientifically and evaluated as the best traps. And so, in a nutshell, that was kind of the birth of the BMP program. It was to be a blend of science, policy, conservation, all designed to improve trapping while keeping it sustainable, and then improving the humaneness and selectivity and some of the other features that we look at. So we wanted to improve trapping, and I guess what happened in the European Parliament was kind of a perfect storm to help create that. At the same time, there were some state fish and wildlife agencies that were either losing or having their trapping programs heavily restricted. State agencies were concerned about that as well. And agencies knew that we needed to do some science on traps so that we really had information about humaneness and selectivity and efficiency and safety. And so, the BMP program came along at a great time because we were able to start collecting a lot of that information. There really hadn't been any scientific studies done to evaluate the humaneness of trapping up to that point in time. And so we were kind of developing the standards and breaking new ground all at the same time.
When it first came out, how did trappers respond? Like when you guys first started this up, were they for it? Were they nervous? Like what was the general response, I guess?
Yeah, there was some skepticism. There was some skepticism within the trapping community about the government kind of stepping in and doing some scientific studies. There were some concerns that this might lead to trapping even being more restricted or something like that. And so over time, fortunately, the trapper associations, the National Trapper Association, the Fur Takers of America, and then, trappers in general, over time, I think the trapping community in the United States has come to see BMPs for what they really are, rather than what they were nervous that they might become. But I think they understand now that BMPs are a tool to really protect the future of trapping. BMPs identify the best performing traps. That gives trapping credibility with the public. It helps defend trapping, when it's challenged. And now, and maybe you guys too, I hear more and more trappers say that, yeah, I use BMP traps because they work. And not just because they're recommended, but because they're some of the best traps, out there that folks can really use. So I think we've gone from skepticism to support, and that's, a good thing.
For sure. I definitely would agree with that, just with what I've seen, just to be, whether that's my own trapping or when I worked in Wisconsin and worked with trappers all the time, there might have been some apprehension in the first part of like, oh, what's going to happen? But right now, the trappers that know about the BMPs are very positive because they know that this is their ace in the hole, so to speak. If they get attacked because their trapping methods are this, that, or the other, barbaric, inhumane, instead of just using emotional arguments, now we've got this mountain of data that we can stand on and actually, and you were talking about developing these standards. These standards aren't something that you just sat in a room and came up with. These were developed by ISO, right? The same organization that developed standards for agriculture and a number of different things.
Engineering. My husband was very excited when you started talking about ISOs. He was like, "Where'd that come from?" Like, he was so excited about it.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little history of that. So, to begin our testing program, one of the things that and there were a lot of countries that were participating in this process. It wasn't just the United States. It wasn't just the European Union. The Canadians were very much involved. The Russians were also very much involved, and there were other countries involved in this process. And we were all trying to work together to develop a standard that we could use to evaluate the humaneness of trapping devices primarily, is what that standard wanted to look at. And so here in the United States, we have a national standard setting body, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, we usually call them. Through the association, we developed a technical advisory group within the American National Standards Institute. That group worked then liaison with the International Organization for Standardization and worked with ISO and a number of other bodies like that from other countries around the world to develop this standard. And so, the group that developed the standard within ISO, when we talk about ISO, what ISO does is it puts groups of experts together to develop standards. And so, there were wildlife veterinarians from around the world, wildlife biologists from around the world that worked to develop this standard and put it together. And so, that standard finally came out in about 1999. And there are standards for live restraint and for lethal capture, that we follow.
Yeah, and so since you mentioned basically the two, we're talking about two major different types of trap types. So the United States took control of testing live restraining traps. And then, as I understand it, Canada basically took control of the killer trap systems with some kind of gentleman's agreement that this data would be shared amongst the two countries.
Yep, that's right, Curtis. So we work hand in hand with our partners in Canada because they have a trap research program, a trap testing program there, just as we do here in the United States. But between Canada and the US, we focus on different pieces of the puzzle. So here in the US, most of our testing is done in the field with live restraining traps. So we're talking about foothold traps, dog-proof traps, or foot encapsulating traps, cage traps, cable restraint devices used by real trappers under normal field trapping conditions. And so that's how we capture those animals every year. And I know we'll go into that probably a little bit more later. What Canada does, they do some of that for their program, but most of what they do is lab-based testing for lethal traps. So we're talking about body grip traps and more recently lethal snares. So they can precisely measure things like impact forces, and then basically how long it takes these devices to render an animal irreversibly unconscious, leading to death. And so, those are very precise measures. When they test traps in the lab, they're basically trying to lapse an animal into brain death as quickly as possible by evaluating the subconscious reflexes of that animal. And so obviously that's something that you can't do in a field. It's very precise. It has to be done in a lab setting with technicians right there watching the whole thing take place. And so, but we share information back and forth. Even when we do want to recommend, body gripping traps here in the U.S. for different species of animal, we look at the animal welfare data from Canada to figure out what traps, meet the standards that we all observe. But we also field test those traps here in the U.S. So those traps have to go through the field testing process so that we can evaluate not just the welfare part, but we want to make sure, that they're efficient, that they're safe, that they're selective, that they're practical. Look at some of those other parameters as well. So it's really, when you compare the U.S. and Canada, it's like two halves of a nerdy wildlife science coin, I guess. They do their part, we do our part. But it all works together to make sure that we have what we need.
Sounds like a good match to me. Good match. So yeah, you kind of alluded a little bit to the methods here, but so like we talked about, Lauren went up and helped you with a carcass carving, what you call it, up in Ashland, Wisconsin, and for that you've collected these carcasses from the previous trapping season, working with actual trappers. Why don't you let us know a little bit about how you do that? How do you line up trappers? And then they let us know a little bit about what they do. They go out with a technician, and the technician is who randomly decides what trap they deploy. Give us the quick and dirty overview of how that's done.
All right. So I'll start off by kind of talking about, how we generate this data. Might be a good place to start. So we run some very carefully designed field projects every year all over the country with expert trappers and then a technician, working with that trapper. And these projects are designed by one of the working groups within the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the organization that I work for. We have a fur bearer conservation technical work group. And so I work with those folks. Those are biologists from all over the country, and they help sort of design these projects and help me get them on the ground. So, but just to give you an idea of the scope of the program, since we started this in 1997, we've conducted over 600 individual field projects across the country. We've conducted field projects in 45 different states, and we've tested over 700 trap types on 23 different species of animals. So it's a pretty big project. On an average year, a year like last year, or a year that we have coming up, we have about 20 trapper technician teams in the field. So we'll have at least 20 trappers that are participating in the BMP projects this year. That's usually over 12 to 15 different states, and we're usually capturing anywhere from 8 to 12 different species a year, with all different types of traps. This year we're using cable restraint devices, foothold traps and cage traps, and dog-proof traps. So we have all those traps deployed in field projects this year. But each trapper works with a technician. They follow the protocol that is dictated, by the ISO procedures. They essentially record every capture, the species, the location, the trap type, the conditions, following, what is required that they record from those international standards. And, with that field data, we can quantify things like the efficiency of the trap, the selectivity of the trap, the safety of the trap, those types of things. And then, veterinarians, all of those animals eventually, get frozen, they get shipped, and we work together every year with a number of veterinarians to conduct necropsies on those animals, and they look at the injuries that those animals received during that capture event based on the ISO protocol. And so all that information ultimately gets, put together, the science from the lab, the science from the field, the practical experience from the field, and we put all that together, in kind of like a big science fair project to create BMPs.
Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, really you got the two major components. You got the field component and then the lab component. So you're generating data, both of those areas. And yeah, it's just, the lab component's really cool. So this is what Lauren got to come and see, the carcass carving. You're getting, some of the best wildlife vets from around the country there, and they're going through these animals like with a fine-tooth comb looking for any possible injury, not just in the paw that was captured, but in other paws, in the teeth, anything you can imagine. And these folks don't miss anything, because I know in the past you've even like checked them with radiographs and X-rays and that sort of thing, and the vets have been really good at catching everything that's there.
Yeah, Curtis. And the nice thing about conducting all those necropsies kind of at the same time with a number of different veterinarians there, when one of those vets does have a question, they can consult with the other veterinarians that are there. They can kind of work together to figure out something if they see something that they believe is kind of unusual or out of the ordinary that they haven't seen before. Another vet might say, "Oh yeah, I've seen that before, and this is what, that's the result of this or that or the other." So it's really great to have all those veterinarians there working together to do these necropsies every year. And we have vets really from every region of the country. And I think that's important because they have the expertise on the various species of animals from their part of the country. And I think that's important because they work on these different species of animals, every day. That's an important part of their job, necropsying animals, trying to figure out, why an animal is dead or whatever. So
And I will
they spend a
say,
lot of time doing that, and so they're good at it.
for seeing, it was kind of amazing. Like, I know, with BMPs, it's you can tell for some things, like it's amazing with things like gray foxes and stuff, how little damage for some of the things you'd see. Like, it was probably a foothold, catch, and just these delicate little toes, and just and some of the vets were funny because they're like, I want to be able to tell, like I want to be able to see, it's like it's
Yeah.
good that I can't, but at the same time, like I want to know, like
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. And, that's a good point, Lauren. With, the ISO protocol has certain trauma categories that injuries are broken into, basically mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe. And one of the things that we realized pretty early on is that we had to create another trauma class, and that was no injury, because a lot of times the veterinarians assess an animal and they honestly can't find injuries on that animal. I mean, there's just no way to tell, like, how was this animal captured? There's no edema, there's no hemorrhage. There's just nothing there that the veterinarian can find on this animal. And about 10% of animals, simply just, they don't get injuries. And, those that do, I mean, the most common injuries are some edema, some swelling, or something like that. So most of the animals are going to have that injury, but that's an injury that they recover from very quickly. The goal of one of the things I probably should have mentioned when I was talking about the ISO protocol, the goal of that protocol for live capture is that when an animal is captured in a live restraint device, we need to be able to release that animal from that trap and not impact its survival. So that animal needs to if we're returning that animal to the wild, it needs to be able to go back and do whatever it was doing, to survive prior to that capture event. And so that standard is pretty rigorous. It's pretty strict, but that's really what we're shooting for with all, capture devices where we want to capture animals alive. And then for lethal capture, we want that animal to die as quickly as possible. And that's the goal of that ISO standard, is to make sure that we, reduce the pain, stress, and suffering of that animal by lapsing it into irreversible unconsciousness as quickly as we can.
Yeah, and so one study that I like to bring up when talking about this, and it's because obviously I spent some time in Wisconsin. They got the bobcat study going on there, but as you know, different critters, they respond to foothold traps differently, and bobcats, being a ambush predator instead of a cursorial predator like the canids, they tend to hold up really well to footholds. And in Wisconsin, these numbers have probably changed now, but by the time I had left, they had, I think it was around 110 bobcats that had been collared. These were all incidentally caught. So these were all people who were trying to catch coyotes or foxes. They incidentally caught a bobcat. They didn't have a tag. They called out the Wisconsin DNR to come put a collar on them. At that time, 110 individuals, they had zero that were capture-related mortalities. And to me, that is amazing. A number that high. I mean, if we set a mist net and we tried to catch 100 birds, we would probably have a mortality, you know? So
Yeah.
that's amazing. And these are just normal trappers. It's not like these were researchers out there trying to do their best not to injure the animals. These were normal trappers just trapping their normal way, you know, and they incidentally caught a bobcat they didn't have a tag for because there's a lot of bobcats in Wisconsin and they wind up in traps. And guess what? All those animals were completely releasable. And a lot of them are still running around Wisconsin right now today with collars on them, collecting data that really not only Wisconsin can benefit from, but the whole country can benefit off what we're learning from those cats, because bobcats are not easy animals to put collars on. So getting a sample size that big is hats off to them for doing that.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. You know, a couple things I'd say to that, Curtis. One is, you know, based on our surveys of trappers nationally, we know that about 80% of the fur bears being captured in the United States are being captured in B&P traps. Most trappers are using B&P traps. And so, you know, that's a good thing. We know that trappers are doing the right thing. Also, there are a lot of other studies like that we could point to that show that, yeah, we can capture animals with different devices and release those animals and have tremendously good survival rates. You know, probably, and you could speak more to this probably than I could even, but, you know, there in Chicago, Illinois, the coyote research projects, you know, that Stan Gert had been doing for many years, they captured, I think, well over 400 coyotes. They were using foothold traps, cable restraints, and I know Illinois still participates in some of those captures with foothold traps and puts radio collars on coyotes, and they're still running all over the city of Chicago and the suburbs. And so, you know, there are just so many studies out there. If you're going to get your hands on a fur bear, you're probably going to have to use a trap to do that. And if you're going to release it, if you're using a B&P trap, then you're probably going to have a good result.
For sure. And yeah, you just made me also think of another example. We'd be remiss if we didn't bring it up, but river otters. I mean, river otters now have been reintroduced into like 22 different states, and the vast majority of those river otters have been caught in number 11 double long spring footholds, which is a great little trap for otter. It's the perfect size just to get a half pad or a full pad catch, and they hold up well, and they've recolonized, you know, over 20 states from that. So it's been an awesome conservation success story that would not be possible if it weren't for these humane capture devices that keep the animal releasable. So awesome stuff.
Yep. Yeah, the same, you know, generally what we're testing through the B&P program are traps that we know trappers are using. You know, we conduct a national survey of trappers every 10 years. We find out what species trappers are most interested in capturing, what trap types they're using to capture those. And then those are the devices that we go out and test, you know, so.
So I was going to ask if that's how you kind of prioritize with these groups to get the projects going, like how you choose what traps and what species to do next. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, when we first started the program, you know, the first national survey of trappers, we asked trappers, you know, what traps are you using for these different species of animals? What are the most important species to you? What are the traps used to capture those? We asked state agencies the similar questions, you know, in terms of damage research. What species are most important to you? What traps are you using? In terms of wildlife damage, you know, we asked the same questions. And so that's what kind of got the B&P program started. And then we keep it going that way by continuing to ask those questions to different groups of folks out there. You know, what species are most important? What devices are you using? So that we make sure that we're evaluating what's actually being used by trappers out there on the landscape.
What were the first couple you guys did, first couple species?
Raccoons and coyotes. And, you know, interestingly, they're still the number, they're still the top. So basically, coyotes and raccoons, the last time we did that study, which was last year, those species tied for being number one. So 61% of trappers say that the raccoon is their most important species. 61% of trappers say that the coyote is their most important species. So
I'll say if I had to guess,
really
those were two of my top three. My third guess was going to be beaver. So
and beavers are right up there. Beavers are up there. Muskrats, bobcats, are some of the top species. But we started off with coyotes and raccoons, and they're still number one. And I think that makes sense too, because I'm going off into the weeds a little bit here. It makes sense that those have always been important species, for the fur trade, but also for damage control. They're very important species for folks that are getting into trapping, for from a wildlife management perspective, that are trying to reduce predation on ground nesting birds or deer. Those are some of the species that they're probably going to focus on as well. So it just makes sense that they have been number one, and they probably will continue to be, the top species in the United States for many years to come. I don't see that changing.
Yeah, so no surprises there. Raccoon, coyote, right there, number 1, 2. And so as far as the last fur bearer you tackled, that was the wolverine, right? Just because that's logistically the most difficult one to do, right?
Yeah. And, we have conducted some field projects in Alaska. Obviously, Alaska is the only place that we can legally capture wolverine in the United States. They're still, common in Canada. But in the U.S., we have to do that in Alaska. And we have tested some body grip trap. We tested the 330 body grip trap there so that we could get the selectivity and the efficiency, safety, practicality, so that we could evaluate those issues. So we have done that. We haven't done any foothold traps for wolverine yet. And it's just a logistical problem. Like you said, Curtis, one of the things that is required by the BMP protocol is that traps be checked every day and animals be removed by noon. So that has to happen on every project that we do. The issue is that in Alaska, a lot of the trapping is done in extremely remote areas where people are going into those areas with snow machines, where they're riding for hours and hours, or they're flying in, and landing airplanes and those types of things. And so, getting traps checked every day before noon for a species like wolverine, it's an immense challenge, and we just haven't conquered that one yet. So, and one of the more common ways to capture wolverines is with the log traps too. It's a big cage trap basically built out of wood. That's something that we're hoping to evaluate eventually as well, because a lot of researchers use those types of traps to capture wolverine.
Sounds like quite the adventure. But another little adventure. So I noticed that you all were recently critiqued about some of your methodology, and so you released a statement about that. Could you let us know, where did that critique originate from? Was this animal rights activists trying to find a weakness? Is that where it came from? And then what were they trying to accomplish?
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question, Curtis, and I'm glad you asked that, and I'll address this professionally. Okay, so really, no, the critique of the BMP program itself came from a group of authors who certainly have biased leanings in my opinion, and they either simply misunderstood or misrepresented how our testing actually works in the BMP program. And just, not to get into the weeds with all the different things that they said, but basically they claimed that, this wasn't legitimate science, it wasn't independent, and that, our conclusions were inaccurate. And what I have to say about that is that, typically when a group wants to critique an article or monograph that has been, through a peer-reviewed process and has been published, that group would go back to that same journal and seek to have their critique or their rebuttal published. This group of authors, their critique was not published in wildlife monographs. They chose to publish that in a different publication. And then also, typically just professionally as scientists, when one group has a dispute with another about something, typically you talk to that group. You make sure that you kind of understand what they're doing before you launch into that critique. And they, this particular group of authors never reached out to myself or any of our co-authors prior to publishing their critique. So our response to that, we published a couple of different kinds of responses. We didn't publish anything in a peer-reviewed outlet because we didn't want to give essentially any credibility to that critique. But our response was basically, here's the science, here's the transparency. This has been through a rigorously peer-reviewed process, that many different scientists have looked at and participated in. And so we didn't make these things up in a back room. It's all out there in the open for people to look at and see. And so, these particular authors were, I think they just misunderstood the BMP program in a lot of instances. And we were able to just clarify all that.
Sure. Well, yeah, that was a professional and very nice response. But kudos to you all for giving a thorough response to that, because it's easy to just blow off something like that when you get it. But that's something I've always liked, what AFWA was doing in trapping and fur bearer management is it's not a hiding game. It's a game of, like, we have the data and we can show it, so we don't need to brush stuff off and hide from it. We can address things full front, and I think that's what you did with the critique that you all have published up on your webpage, which of course we will link to in the show notes here. But if you don't have that link handy, if you just remember AFWA, which is like AFLAC, but AFWA, AFWA, fur bearer management, and Bryant's probably laughing because he's heard John Olson say that exact same thing. I'm taking those words directly from John Olson's mouth, but if you remember AFWA, fur bearer management, you will go to that page and they've got just a slew of awesome resources for trappers, wildlife researchers, anything, whether you're somebody that's looking for what traps you want to buy or just doing a little bit of research on trapping, or what might even be more useful is the talking points, because as a trapper, you got to be able to be ready to represent trappers everywhere. And I know that's a lot of weight on your shoulders, but you all do it so well by breaking it down into some key messages that trappers can convey to the public if they get questioned. And I love those resources. So do you have any off the top of your head, like, of your favorite key messages for trappers if they're in a parking lot holding a trap and some city person comes up firing stuff like, "Oh, trapping is barbaric, you hillbilly"? What are some of the things that they should summon up to say in that situation?
Yeah. Curtis, we do a lot of kind of public attitude surveys about trapping to find out what the public does think about it. And one of the things that we always find out that is the most common perception about trapping is that people don't do that anymore. That's what the majority of the public thinks. They don't really realize that trapping is even still occurring. And most people, the first thing that they'll think of when they think about trapping, they'll say, maybe if I had a raccoon under my porch, I'd call someone and they could come trap it, or a skunk, or maybe a coyote cruising the neighborhood. Oh yeah, someone could come trap that. But the public is so unfamiliar with trapping that there's a big leap. There's a big gap in their knowledge. And so we know what their primary concerns are, and we know that we have, messages and data that can deal with what those primary concerns are. But really, the first thing I would tell trappers to talk about is the fact that trapping is highly regulated. Trapping is science. It's a science-based management tool. It's essential for wildlife conservation. We use it to control damage. We use it for research. We use it for reintroduction programs, relocations of species, not just, capturing animals for fur. So trapping, it's a highly regulated activity, and it's based on science. And a lot of people that don't understand that trapping still goes on, they wouldn't know that. And so that's an important thing to tell them. Another thing, is that BMP traps are tested and proven to be humane. They're selective, they're efficient, they're safe. There's a lot of testing that has gone into that. And so we can capture animals humanely. The old argument that trapping is cruel, that's just kind of gone out the window. If you believe science, you can look at our data and see that we can capture animals very humanely. And then I guess the third thing that I would tell trappers is keep in mind that we're all ambassadors. Every trap you set, every interaction you have with the public, and when I say public, I mean that could be another hunter, that could be somebody out mushroom hunting, that could be somebody cutting wood, whatever. It could be somebody in a parking lot, like you mentioned. But every interaction that you have with the public shapes how people see trapping. And so, do your best to represent trapping positively always, because if you're participating in this activity, you've got a stake in it, and we're all ambassadors when we're out there doing it.
Yeah, I'm always amazed, even with our stuff, how many people just telling them, we've talked about this before with our stuff, but how many people think of like the rusted bear trap or man trap with like the teeth, and we're like, no, those aren't a thing, and you have to check your traps like every day, and they're like, oh, like usually even just that amount of information, people are like, oh, okay, like they're much more open, you know what I mean? Like even just a tiny amount of information that's like positive, and if you're nice about it, people are much more willing to listen.
Yeah.
For sure. And I realized this like when I was a kid asking for permission, so back whatever, kid in Missouri asking for permission, I started carrying a trap with me because I noticed I was getting, people would say no. I had one lady in particular that was like, oh, no, we don't allow trapping, none of that stuff. And then like we got to talking later and she saw the traps that I was using and she was like, oh, you're setting those little things? She had imagined that I was setting like these giant big metal things that were going to be dangerous to her and her family and her pets and her cows and all this kind of stuff. And then when she saw that I had these number 11 double long springs and 1.5 coil springs and all these small little traps, I got permission. And from that day forward, I was like, wow, people don't even know what I'm using. I'll just carry one of these little traps up there. And sometimes I'd even snap it right on my hand, and show them like, hey, like this is what I'm using. I'm trying to catch like muskrats, mink, maybe some raccoons. I'm not going after a bear. This is the middle of Missouri here. We're small equipment. So just that, like, I didn't know people weren't that exposed to trapping that they didn't even know, but just that little bit of information went a long way and helped me probably get more permission when I was a kid.
I do see
Yeah.
that a lot too. Like, oh, trappers wouldn't use these if they had to be trapped in them. And I'm like, I mean, like, I feel like everybody's gotten stuck a finger or a boot or something,
Yeah. And I think when a lot of people think about a trap, they're thinking of the kind of trap that, Wile E. Coyote was always trying to use to catch the road runner.
Yeah, like it's gonna chop you up, and
big
yeah,
tooth trap, and that's what they think of, or some bear trap or something like that. And
like I said,
they don't.
I wish people could see just these delicate little fox feet and how just undamaged they were. Like it was just like, think about like your cat's foot that was probably caught in a foothold, and it just nothing. Like it was just perfect.
Yep.
Yeah, certainly trapping has come a long way in the past 30, 40 years. And I would say AFWA, the BMP program, is as responsible as that for anything out there. So definitely huge thanks from trappers everywhere for what you all are doing. I mean, you all have given trappers, like we talked about, this mountain of data to stand on, and it's made us a lot more ironclad than we were probably 20, 30 years ago, which is awesome. And we always got to be careful. We always got to make sure we're doing things the best way possible. But yeah, just this whole process has ensured that trappers are doing that, and it's just a model for success moving forward. And I guess that leads me to kind of our last question is what's on the horizon for AFWA and fur bearer management? Obviously, you're going to continue the BMP testing, but is there anything else in the works that's coming up now that maybe the bulk of the BMP testing is, I don't want to say it's done because there's always stuff to test, but you've got so much done. I wonder if you're starting to dip your toes in other things.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, all the what we would consider the primary fur bearer species, BMPs are complete for those 22 different species of fur bearers that we have a BMP for. And if you look in those BMPs, we've tested almost every kind of device that there is for that particular animal. If you look in the raccoon BMP, you'll see foothold traps, body grip traps, foot encapsulating traps, cage traps, cable restraint devices, all that we've tested on raccoons.
I was really going through that one the other day, and it just kept going. I was like, man, this is vast.
40 pages long. Yeah. Or if you look at the coyote BMPs, we've tested, I don't know, 30, 40 different types of foothold traps, that have met the criteria. Cable restraint devices, what we might, foot snare, Belial foot snare, those types of things. And so, we have, I wouldn't say we've completed the BMPs, but there is a BMP for most of the major fur bearers in the U.S., with the exception of Wolverine. But really, the work's never really done. We conduct field projects every year. We update older BMPs with new information, new traps that we've tested, new techniques that we've discovered. We also, in the BMP program, some of the things that we're looking at now are like non-target capture in urban areas. How do we avoid the capture of incidental species, when we're capturing in urban areas? We're all the time expanding our outreach, doing more workshops for state fish and wildlife agencies to educate their staff about how to talk about trapping, working with the trapping community as well, to try to educate folks on how to talk about trapping, and doing things like fur schools where we bring in state, tribal, federal agency employees to really learn about what trappers do and how they do it, so they have a greater appreciation. And then, we're working with managers, policymakers, who may not know a lot about trapping as well, but who may have to make decisions about trapping. So just, the gamut of individuals out there that we need to educate about trapping. We're doing the best that we can to reach out to those folks.
For sure. And I'm glad you mentioned the outreach too, because obviously we've been focusing on the BMPs and what all goes into that, but the outreach is another awesome component. And you all did a Trapping Matters workshop here in Illinois last year, right? So Trapping Matters workshops are awesome. It's like a little workshop you can come to, and in a brief session, you kind of learn a little bit about what trapping in modern day America is like. And for people who are not exposed to trapping, especially people like we're talking about that might be working as wildlife managers or conservation police officers, game wardens, they need some kind of exposure to trapping. And whether that's through a fur school that's a little more immersive, longer, or these Trapping Matters workshops, which are a shorter, quick, dirty version that just kind of gives you the fire hose of trapping to the face. These are awesome ways for folks to learn about trapping. And I guess, do you have any plans for Trapping Matters workshops close to Illinois in the coming year or two?
So, Curtis, we started the Trapping Matters workshop. I'll give you a little bit of history of that. Back in 2003, we held the first Trapping Matters workshop at a Wildlife Society conference in Burlington, Vermont in 2003. Since that time, we've conducted over 200 Trapping Matters workshops in 40 48 states, I believe. We've held workshops in 48 different states. We've educated over 7,000 state, tribal, federal agency wildlife professionals about trapping. And yeah, trapping matters. Like you said, it's a fire hose. We consider it a trapping awareness course. And so basically, when we bring people into the Trapping Matters workshop, we want to educate them about everything that we can about trapping in one day. So they learn about the different trap types, how they work, how you'd set that. They learn about how we use trapping in wildlife management. They learn about the BMP program, and they come away with that. We spend quite a bit of time talking about how to communicate with the public about trapping. And so we give them a lot of communication tips, key messages to use, and those types of things. And so it's a great workshop. And
I went to
we're
one
doing.
in June. It was great. I recommend
There
it.
was one in June. Yeah, back in first week of June, I think we did 2 workshops there. I wasn't actually there for those.
Oh yeah, there
My
were 2.
colleagues
That's right.
conducted those, but those, yeah, I guess that was in Springfield at the headquarters probably.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Curtis, there are always Trapping Matters workshops going on in different states, and Wisconsin has probably a couple coming up this year and maybe next year for sure. So that's a state that's nearby. And then we do 12 or 13 Trapping Matters workshops every year. So there will be a Trapping Matters workshop in that vicinity sometime in the next year. This year, we still have workshops to do in New Jersey, New Hampshire, and Oregon. So we still have a few workshops going on this year.
Nice. Well, yeah, keep a lookout for that, and definitely, if you get to where you want to start putting one together in the Chicago region, I'm sure we would be very interested in trying to help, facilitate that, because that's where the bread and butter of our folks are, kind of the Chicago region. I feel like that area is prime for some trapping education.
Yeah, and I will say, interestingly, in the Chicago area, we work. One of the groups that helps us deliver Trapping Matters workshops is the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation, and they're, right outside of Chicago, and we use some folks that work pretty heavily with a program that the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation sponsors called Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow. We work with some of their staff to help us deliver Trapping Matters workshops. So.
Awesome. So yeah, we've covered a ton. We've covered BMPs. We've covered the outreach, pretty much everything trapping, AFWA, fur bearer management. Wow, I don't know. I guess my last question is: do you have a favorite fur bearer, and why? What is it? Why?
People would probably stone me for this, but my favorite fur bearer is the coyote. I think coyotes are they're fascinating animals. They're so adaptable. Their social interactions are so interesting. They can get in trouble. They can create some issues with wildlife damage, but also they can cohabitate in urban areas without causing a lot of problems. I mean, there are a lot of coyotes in Chicago that definitely don't get into trouble very often. There are those that get in trouble, of course. But even here in Arizona, coyotes are ubiquitous, really in this, arid landscape where few things can survive. There are always coyotes. And really, if you look across the United States, coyotes are ubiquitous just in every state, in every habitat. They're a fascinating animal. They're essentially a dog, and I love dogs. And so there are probably people who would disagree with me, but I think a coyote is one of the most fascinating fur bearers out there. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for those animals. I trap them with foothold traps and cable restraint devices, and they are a challenging animal to capture. They, they'll let you know how good you are rather than just how good you think you are.
I think Curtis has
Sure.
told me that same thing. He's like, you'll know if you've actually caught one, if you're actually a good trapper or not.
Yeah.
Sure, I echo those statements, and even trappers who are far greater than me, like Mike Wilhite, the editor of the Trappers Post, who's trapped every canid you can imagine, including dozens and dozens of wolves. A coyote is by far the hardest animal to trap on average, and it makes sense if you think about it. Just look at how persecuted coyotes are across the United States. Not only do they usually have the longest hunting season, most of them are listed as a nuisance animal that landowners could take year round if they deem them to be a nuisance. And we know that most landowners just kind of deem any coyote to be a nuisance if it's in the vicinity. So we're really talking about one of the most highly persecuted animals on the countryside. And so when you're talking about people are calling themselves a really good hunter when they get a big buck, well, if you get a coyote that's that same age, I would argue that you've done something even better, because the coyotes are even more persecuted than a big buck. So if you really want to challenge yourself against the smartest animal in the woods, you got to become a coyote trapper.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why they're one of my favorite, probably my favorite fur bear species, is just because they're fascinating, they're interesting, they're challenging. And yeah, they teach you a lot.
I bet it ain't your favorite to skin, though. I'll take a muskrat or a red fox on that one any day.
He was showing us all kinds of tips, though, at the BMP necropsy thing. Though, it was good.
I've skinned a few. I'm pretty sure, Curtis, my first coyote took me 3 hours to skin, but I've improved since then.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, I think I was 3 or 4 hours, and I broke a string. I had it hanging from a string on a rafter, and I was pulling so hard that I broke the rope that it was tied to. I don't know what pound test that was. It was pretty high, but I snapped it trying to pull that thing apart. But one thing also I think we got to mention is that we forgot to mention is at the end of these carcass carving events, as much of the fur that can be utilized is utilized. So these animals are skinned and put up, fleshed and dried. And a lot of these pelts go back into educational programs and things of that nature. So not only are you getting all this data, but you're actually putting these furs to good use too.
Yes, we do. And even the skulls, the skulls of the animals and some other pieces and parts of, baculum, those types of things of these animals, we do salvage a lot of that, including the fur. And that fur and skulls and pieces and parts, they go back into, either educating folks about the BMP program or trapper education programs. And so, and one of the things I'll mention quickly, I know I've been talking a long time, but we very often partner the BMP program with other sorts of research efforts, and so for the past couple of years, we've been testing all the animals that we capture for SARS-CoV-2. We've been testing fur bears for chronic wasting disease. And, I'm hoping to do some projects in the future testing fur bears for HPAI and maybe some other diseases that might be out there on the landscape. And
toxoplasmosis.
I'd really like to get some projects going on where we're looking at reducing predation, on ground nesting birds and those types of things to really get some evaluations of, we know that ground nests are subject to predation, turkeys, a lot of those nests end up getting predated. And what we like to figure out is, if we go in and do some trapping in those areas, does it have an effect? Are we going to improve the success of those nests and those types of things? So we like to partner the BMP research with as much as we possibly can as well.
For sure, yeah. You might not have heard it. I tried to throw out there toxoplasmosis as one of the things. Is that one of the ones you're looking for too?
We are not looking for that specifically, but
if anybody ever wants to get Curtis on a rant, that's just all I have to bring up is feral cats and toxoplasmosis.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
I wonder so obviously we know like feral cats distributed across the landscape. I just wonder what it might be doing to different mustelids, because we know there are some mustelids that are highly susceptible to toxoplasmosis. And yeah, just for example, in Wisconsin, marten and fisher, is that interrupting their reproduction, the level of toxoplasmosis in the environment? Has that ever been looked at? I'm not sure.
I don't know, Curtis, but I know we are capturing marten and fisher in some projects this year, and that might be something that we could figure out how to look at. I'll investigate that. Not in Wisconsin. We're capturing those animals in New York, Maine, and Montana. So
okay, well, yeah, they got cats there too, so it's all good.
I'm sure they do.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for talking about this stuff. I mean, obviously, Lauren and I, we could talk about trapping and stuff forever. It's interesting stuff, and you all are at the cutting edge. Everything here with the BMPs and the Trapping Matters workshop, whether it's getting the data we need so that our tools are the best that they can be, or
we talk about too, like wanting to be able to release and stuff like that, but trappers also care about, you know, like not just humaneness for like the public sake, you know what I mean? But like we want to be, you know, treating animals well as well. Like I feel like that point sometimes gets a little glossed over. Like it's a thing we're also worried about. So sorry to interrupt you, Curtis, but
oh no, it's all good. And just helping with all your key messages. I mean, you all are such a resource to trappers. Like I said, we'll put the link to the AFWA Fur Bearer Management page here in the show notes. And definitely even if you're not interested in trapping, if you're a hunter, check this stuff out, because this is cool stuff. And trapping's come a long way in the past 30 or 40 years. And it's all right there for you to look at, all the information. It's cool stuff. Thanks for talking to us, Bryant. And yeah, try to enjoy that 110-degree day you got in Arizona.
I'm going to stay in the air conditioner, Curtis, but thank you.
All right. Well, good luck once it cools down. I know you got a couple tags this fall, so once it becomes actually not the surface of the sun outside, you can go out and maybe start flinging some arrows, getting ready for those seasons.
Yep. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Good luck, Bryant. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.